Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I'm the chief economist at American Compass. But today, for once, I am pleased to say I am royally out-economisted, which is the technical term, by our guest, Professor Simon Johnson of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and reigning Nobel Laureate. He has done incredible work on a number of subjects, especially on institutions that are key to economic prosperity, obviously a subject near and dear to my heart. And we actually found ourselves talking a couple of weeks ago about science and what is going on with science funding, where there are quite legitimate complaints about how higher education is working, about how science is working, but also the reasons that funding is very important and various types of reform that might address the problem. I'm especially excited about, and we have a great conversation about the question of how do you just spread the funding more widely? Would it in fact make sense to be making the kinds of cuts we're seeing at a lot of the most prestigious universities if that money instead went to funding new labs and new cohorts of grad students in entirely different parts of the country? So definitely some areas of disagreement, also some very interesting areas of agreement, and I think some potential for real policy reform. I think you'll enjoy the conversation. Of course, I have to tell you about what we have going on at Commonplace. A very eclectic week. We had FTC Chairman Andrew Ferguson, adaptation from his remarks recently on the attention economy and how big tech is harming our kids. He is showing real leadership on that issue, and this is a great overview of his views on it. We had Nick Rowan on how assisted suicide has been able to continue to win in the States, which seems like an issue that is only likely to grow in prominence. And a really fun feature from Jude Russo reviewing James Comey's new crime novel. Yes, James Comey has a crime novel, and you will be shocked to learn that it is a politically motivated anti-conservative crime novel. I would say Jude gives it roughly the respect it deserves and makes a number of important points along the way. So check those out. Of course, subscribe to Understanding America, where I was writing about my love of Oregon Trail and the computer lab and why we need to bring it back. But that is enough for me. Let me hand you over to my conversation with Professor Simon Johnson. And here we are with Professor Simon Johnson. Professor, thank you so much for joining us for the podcast.
Great pleasure to be with you.
We found ourselves off on the left coast together recently and arguing about all sorts of things science related. And I found it a fascinating conversation. I said, first of all, I just want to talk about it more, but it would be terrific if others could listen in. So here we are. Really appreciate you making the time, and wanted to sort of start with just a question about how you understand what's going on right now. Obviously, a lot of actions in the Trump administration are, some might say addressing, others might say attacking science funding, various research institutions. Give us the lay of the land from your perspective. What are the most important? What are the most costly? What, if anything, do you see as justified or on the right track?
Okay, well, there's a lot of questions in there, Oren, and let's get to them all, but we'll try and break it into a couple of pieces.
Yes.
So first of all, what's going on? I think it is really quite unfortunate that the way in which some issues, which we'll talk about, which are legitimate issues, are being approached, is creating a lot of uncertainty in and around the university sector. So it may surprise people who are not in the university world to know that even though these universities are quite big and even though they have, large headline endowments and so on, they actually operate on, in their own minds, relatively thin margins. They expect a certain amount of money to come in. They expect to spend a certain amount of money on graduate students in particular. That's a key pain point at this moment. And if they expect a significant decline in federal dollars, for example, 10% or 20% off the bat, and then maybe another 20, 30, 40%, depending on what happens further, they don't want to make commitments to graduate students. They don't want to admit grad students into their programs. And if we're talking about science, which I think it focuses our conversation, so physics, biology, chemistry, and all the different combinations, the grad students are really the workforce and the creative force in that space. So when you take fewer in today, you're going to get less output, not tomorrow because it takes a while, but 3, 4, 5 years. That's when the graduate students are really most productive. Now, they're working in structures with professors. They're working in big labs. They also go on, of course, to either academic careers, or most of them, the majority, will go on to private sector careers. So this is the workforce of the private sector 10, 20 years down the road. And the problem, Oren, I think particularly, is that if you disrupt it today, tomorrow, let's say we have one confused year, and then let's say we get back on track even, you don't make that year up because it's those people who would have gone to grad school have gone to do something else. They've gone into finance. They've gone to study in another country. They've just pursuing a different career. So I fear that we're losing talent in this pipeline process that we're not going to get back. And I think that's regrettable.
Yeah, it's a helpful distinction because I think, just looking at it from afar, the first thing you think is just, oh, well, if there's less funding, there's just going to be less research happening. And it is there will be fewer papers published, for instance, that's the loss. And to your point, there is both a human capital issue generally. It's also a much longer pipeline that you're sort of talking about the front end of. That being said, I think, certainly my sense of what has gone on in university research contexts, in graduate programs generally, is there is both a certainly very wide degree in the types of programs going on within universities, what's being funded, what's being done. And then it also seems like there are a lot of controversies around who the graduate students are, how they're treated, whether these are even attractive positions and so forth. So I'm curious to what extent you think the system had been working well versus the system really did need a shakeup, but you would shake it up differently in a sense.
Well, there's lots of people who want to shake up the system. There's no question about that. And from all parts of the political spectrum, and hopefully we'll talk about their different concerns and perspectives. Yeah, I do think that in terms of priorities, Oren, which is very important, the deal that was struck with universities a little bit during World War II and a lot after World War II, which was not the deal at all prior to, let's say, 1940. Universities had very little federal funding. Federal government didn't put much money into research and development outside of a little bit of military stuff prior to World War II. So we're talking about a relatively recent deal that was done. The deal was the terms of the deal were set by the federal government. And it has always been the case, it remains the case, that the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, and separately, but also important, Department of Defense, those are the four main funders of research. They set the priorities, Oren. So they say, we want to research this or that. And there's, as you know, political appointees at the top of those agencies, as there should be, because this is very important, delegated budgetary authority, if you like, from Congress, passing obviously through the executive branch, and the president decides who heads these agencies. So the agencies decide what they want to fund. They set the priorities entirely. And key topic, which we've got to dig into, I'm sure we will, overhead rates. Those overhead rates are also set by those agencies. Now, they've been set in a process over many years. Typically, there's one body that sets the overhead rates for a particular university. I believe for historical reasons, MIT, for example, it's the Office of Naval Research. It's just a historical thing. And lots of questions about, are those the right overhead rates? Are they too high? How is that overhead rate money spent? I think those are very legitimate questions to be addressed in a proper framework. But it is, I want to emphasize, it's the federal government's money, it's the taxpayers' money spent by the federal government, and the federal government has the authority to spend that as they wish. And if they say we want to focus all our money on, I don't know, going to the moon, which was a lot of priority in the 1960s, for example, that's what we do. All this effort goes into go to the moon. If you don't want to go to the moon, the federal government doesn't want to go to the moon, we don't spend any money on it. We're not going to research going to the moon. So the federal government is very much in the driving seat. And I think everybody, and this, by the way, was one reason scientists didn't want federal money in the 1920s and 30s. There was a discussion about it. A lot of scientists were, I would say, relatively not enthusiastic about the New Deal. They were the leading lights that I've read were not FDR supporters prior to World War II. And they said, we don't want federal money in universities because it'll come with strings attached. I think what happened after World War II is there were some strings attached, but not a huge amount. Mostly the focus was on getting the research done. And probably we could spend the money better. Probably could spend the money differently now, for sure. It is the federal government's prerogative to decide. I would just urge that we make that decision in a way that doesn't cause undue disruption and sort of negative spiller effects on economic prosperity and jobs that nobody wants, just because it's a bit more fragile, this system, than you might think.
Right. So I'm glad you brought up overhead, because this is exactly what I was going to ask about next. And for listeners less in the weeds, to correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially when the federal government gives a grant, there's some share of the money that is for the specific project, and the university also expects to receive some share of the funding to cover the overhead that supports the ability to do that work. In some cases, the overhead share of funding could be 30%, even up to 50%, and a perhaps warranted, at least in some cases, criticism has been, well, wait a minute, a significant share of this funding then isn't actually going to the dedicated purpose. To some extent, it might be cross-subsidizing other activities that, in fact, the university cannot directly get grants for. And so one thing the Trump administration done has been generally to cap overhead at 15%, which in theory, I think what the Trump administration would say is, well, we are still funding all of the important research we want to fund this way. We are just stopping the cross-subsidization of less valuable stuff that we never intended to fund in the first place, and is more generally probably what's driving a lot of people nuts about the structure of higher education. So I've included a description and maybe a more normative judgment there, but tell me how fair or not both elements of that are.
Well, look, the overhead rate is, as you said, negotiated. Actually, I would say it's set by the federal government. The federal government has the right to set these rates, and the federal government, these agencies to which the delegated responsibility, like the Office of Naval Research, they're supposed to look at how the universities operate and decide, what is genuine overhead across all of these legitimate research activities, and therefore should be paid for from a pool, and what is the direct cost. So, what's the cost of running electricity? What's the cost of running other infrastructure around the university? And also recognizing, and this again is part of the post-war deal, which could be undone, but it's worked out pretty well, which is that having a lot of young people involved in these research enterprises, including undergraduates still cutting their teeth and these young graduate students, and having it happen in a university teaching environment has some positive effects that you wouldn't get, for example, if you put all of our research, federal research money into national labs, which we do. The Department of Energy has very big, powerful, and successful national labs. But they're not universities. They don't have students. They don't have a lot of younger people. And I think they have their role, don't get me wrong. But I think that the idea of having a university infrastructure around the science research, that was the post-war deal. I think it served us well. It does come with a certain overhead rate. If you want to negotiate those overhead rates down, that is absolutely federal government prerogative, and they should proceed. Whether setting an arbitrary, immediate 15% overhead is the right number, I would suggest is probably not. But, I think these agencies should look at it, and they should have their negotiations, and you can attach terms and conditions, Oren. It's saying we don't want to cross-subsidize the following activities. Or, and of course, Congress has done this for a long time, if you want to have any federal money coming to university at all, this is how you must treat women, or this is how you must treat other protected classes named in specific legislation. So that's, of course, not just fine, that's the law already. So changing the law, that's what Congress does. And then changing how you interpret the law, well, that's what executive branches can do and, have always done. And I think you should just be a little careful not to disrupt things unduly. But renegotiate overhead rates, there's no way to complain about that. I do also want to stipulate a couple of things I think we agree on, Oren. One is that too many universities have built up too much bureaucracy. If you look at the administrative costs across private universities and public universities, so it's across the entire sector, there's way more administrators than there used to be. The ratio of administrators to faculty administrators to students is extremely high and risen a lot. And that is something that needs to be addressed. I think you have complete bipartisan agreement on that. You may not have agreed on how to do it, but I think that should be addressed. The second
my experience
thing
in Washington is that the bipartisan agreement on any attempt to reduce administration or funding in higher education would be deeply lacking. But that is a political rather than substantive observation.
Fair enough. The other thing that I think we agree on, Oren, I know we agree on, is that the research dollars became tilted far too much towards a few places, meaning some specific universities and also clusters of universities on the East Coast and on the West Coast. And what you should do is rebalance that portfolio. And because a lot of science is driven by where the labs are, and it's very capital intensive, scientists will come to where the capital spending will take place. So economists, by the way, doing economics is not very capital intensive. Economists tend to cluster where other economists are. It's hard to induce them to move to other places. Building a lab doesn't mean much. But if you're building a big biochemistry lab or a big physics lab or a big physics facility, the scientists will come to that. And so why not build it in other parts of the country where we have tons of talent? People want more good jobs. We know that science creates positive spillovers for people who don't have PhDs, lots of spillover effects in the community. And I wrote a book about this with John Gruber in 2019 called Jumpstarting America. Yeah. We identified 100 places in 36 states that would be great to do this sort of thing. And on this one, there was a little bit of bipartisan support, Oren, because the Chips and Science Act, which obviously had some other things in it, 2022 got, I think, 64 or 65 senators supporting it, including lots of senators from Republican states. And John and I were absolutely thrilled by that because that was exactly the message we were trying to deliver, which is, hey, let's do more science. Let's spread it around the country. Let's commercialize it as much as possible. And let's power the private sector to a whole new wave of breakthroughs. by really putting a lot of public money into things that have spillover effects that the private sector won't do the fundamental science by itself, but then it can commercialize it and create intellectual property and generate good jobs. That's the magic combination, I think, we're pushing with. And I think that you agree with that.
Yeah, I think we do. And I definitely want to talk a little bit more toward the end about what are some kind of concrete policy tools you could pursue in that respect. On the specifics of the university funding, though, I think the one other big question I tend to have about these questions of, okay, well, you can put stipulations on what the funding can and can't go to and so forth, is that to at least a significant extent, money is fungible. And to the extent that the federal government funds some things, the university is left with relatively more of its own money. It's what are extraordinarily large endowments in some cases, what are extraordinarily intensively subsidized tuition payments in many others, to allocate how they want. And so I think if I were looking at, let's say, overhead rates and saying, no, I want these to come way down, part of that would be not just believing that the science can be done at such a low overhead rate, but believing that, in fact, these institutions themselves have amassed enormous resources, that what makes them successful and allows them to amass these resources is, to a significant extent, the science that is being subsidized. And in fact, to continue operating those successful science programs, to be, nurturing those pipelines of graduate students, that is in fact their job. It's not saying they should just be doing to the extent the federal government is covering it. And gosh, I can think of a lot of other things at these universities, to your point about bureaucracy and so forth, certain amounts of capital expenditures on student centers. It seems like there are other places that funding could actually go from the university to help address this. And the only way that would happen is if the federal government says you are going to have to do that.
Yeah, look, I take the point, Oren, and I think the federal government has and will continue to express its preferences about a lot of these things. I think you want to get the incentives right. I think you want the universities to want to go out and raise money from donors. I think you want to have donor preferences, some space for donors to express their preferences. And I think you want to sort of get that public-private partnership, continue to strengthen it. I'm from the UK, as you likely know. And in the UK, the government pays for pretty much everything at the universities. There's very little philanthropy. I don't think that's the right combination. MIT, by the way, was originally a land-grant college. So it was founded based on the gift of land, or the sale of donated land by the federal government, gave the state of Massachusetts some money to start a university. But they decided to turn it into a private university, I think mostly to mobilize the philanthropy. So I think that is a good combination. I hear you on, what if the donors want something that the federal government really doesn't want? Well, again, there are terms and conditions you can attach to overhead, certainly for the science funding. There's things you can specify in law. If you're a university, you must treat people in the following ways. I think having a framework. I do agree also that the university should put more of their own resources into supporting science. The goal of this sector cannot be to have infinitely large endowments. Right. That makes no sense at all, right? So the universities have a supremely privileged position. Now, obviously, there's big variation within the university sector, but successful universities have done very well on a tax advantageous situation, not paying federal tax and typically not paying local tax, not required to pay local estate tax. And I think it is entirely reasonable for people to say, well, what have the universities done for me recently? And if the answer is build a bigger endowment and hire some faculty and generate some jobs for PhDs in a few cities, that's not very satisfactory. I think the university should recommit themselves to the scientific enterprise and to break through science and technology, and they should use their endowments to do that. I have absolutely no problem with that. Whether you want to have a stiff tax on endowment income or whether you want to just press them to spend more of their endowment on some specified objectives, I mean, that's an interesting question. Right. But having the universities really focus on contributing to American society, and by American society, I mean all regions, all peoples, leave no one behind, or another thing I know you and I agree on. I think that they're a great resource that is, in some sense, been ironically and strangely underutilized in our national economic development, maybe even for our national security. And I think that's what we should be pushing them on.
Yeah, no, that's a great segue into so what does good reform look like? I want to ask you though one other question first because you said sort of the what have you done for me lately question, and I think certainly on the right of center, that question interestingly is increasingly being asked about science itself. There is a view that the replication crisis is actually infecting the physical sciences as well. That innovation has actually slowed measurably in a lot of fields, and that essentially science, as it is done, has not been delivering a very good return on investment. And I think strikingly in recent years, you're seeing various indexes that suggest, the Chinese system is catching up in many areas, surpassing what the American model is producing. And so I'm curious to what extent, even, imagining this was all at national labs, putting the higher education dimension of this aside, to what extent do you think there is a genuine need to rethink sort of how science is funded, how science operates, or is it an institution that is essentially functioning well, and if we put more in, we can be confident we'll get more out?
Okay, great question with a number of different pieces. Let me try and break it down. First of all, China is definitely making progress on science, putting a lot of money into science and generating innovations, which they then go on and apply in their society, sometimes through free market means and a lot of times through more directed means. So, and that's really changed a lot over the past 25 years. Secondly, what China's done mostly, I would say, is copy us. And they've learned from the American model. Now, again, public-private don't mean the same things in China. Right. I get that, as in the United States. But finding ways to motivate researchers and fund them going forward and then bring those ideas into some sort of commercial setting. Yeah, the Chinese do that a lot. And I'm not a big fan of the Chinese model, even in terms of its own longevity and how it will do in the next couple of decades. But there's no question they've made big steps. And it's a big threat to us. Maybe in terms of, I call it national security, but my national security is very broadly defined to include our ability to produce things, to compete, to dominate sectors that we want to dominate, where, technology, controlling the terms of technology development is actually worth something to you, as opposed to just having to buy it from the world. So China is snapping at our heels, or maybe they're pulling level with us in many ways. It is also the case, I think this is definitely true, that the returns on the amount of money you need to put in to get a certain amount of innovation seems to have gone up. It's maybe getting harder to innovate, certainly in some spaces. Now, AI may change this. We don't know. And I think I'm a big believer of some of the things that Friedrich von Hayek said, Oren, including that, two of us who are pretty well informed, or even if we had 20 well informed people in the room, would know almost nothing about the future that'd be useful, because it's all about decentralization of information. It's all about ideas that out there, you don't know who has the good idea, you don't know where they're going to come from. And a good, well-functioning market system should be about identifying all kinds of ideas, backing them with capital, having them compete with each other, and then the better ideas win and the less good ideas disappear or get bought out by the better ideas. So that's not China's advantage doing that particularly, but right. They've done well anyway. That is the heart of the American system, I would say, historically. And I think that's what we should be reinvigorating. I would do it with more money. And I think the best way to respond to China is not with tariffs, not by trying to shut them out of world markets, not by, cutting them off from chips or raw materials or whatever. I would say you want to outcompete them by out-inventing them. Now, that doesn't mean that I want to do it with exactly the system we have. For example, Renaissance Philanthropies, run by a very interesting chap called Tom Khalil, has, I think, a rather brilliant idea of funding innovations through philanthropy. They're not taking, I think, federal money on this. They're looking for ideas that have big potential spillover effects in science, but are not being taken up by conventional scientists, or university-based scientists, I should say, because they're not the kind of ideas that will get you published in a certain kind of journal or get you tenure. I think that's really clever, which is like, let's find the gaps, the things that are not being funded, where we think there's big spillover effects. Now, why do I say spillover effects? Because if there are no spillover effects, the private sector will do it. I'm quite confident that, some one or more big companies or deep-pocketed VCs will pounce on an idea where they think they can get the intellectual property and they think they can get the value. And that's what we're seeing in the AI space, honestly. But for other issues, where there's spillover effects, general knowledge that's being created, private sector hesitates because they don't get all the benefits, even if they pay all the investment costs. So some combination of federal government money, philanthropy, and brilliant individuals backed by friends and family, that's what we've done historically. And I would do more of that, and probably more emphasis on the Tom Khalil Renaissance Philanthropies piece, Oren. But I'm not saying they need federal subsidies either. I'm saying that just as part of our national investment portfolio, we should have a broad set of different kinds of attempts to find the next breakthrough technology.
Yeah, interesting. And I found the work Tom is doing, I think, is and the kinds of things they're addressing, like you said, are they're interesting in the it underscores how big a gap there is out there to fill, but also that there are ways to fill it, which I think is really encouraging. All right, so if we do want to reform higher education and research institutions in various ways, I think I really like the way you put. I won't get the words exactly right, but thinking about the extent to which they are truly fulfilling their mission, given all of the advantages they receive in various ways, given all the things that a nation like ours needs from them. You mentioned the geographic element. We should definitely dig into that one. Are there a couple of others? What would be the sort of few areas that you see as somebody who really, believes that higher education has gone off the rails, needs course corrections? Where would you be putting your attention?
Well, I have to say, I'm not very keen on the legacy system. So legacies, just to remind everyone, are a system which children and grandchildren of people who went to a particular school have some preference. Now, the preference may vary, and it may not be a lot of preference, but, it's hard to know exactly. Some prominent universities have up to 40% of their undergraduates as legacies. Now, they do this sort of a little bit paradoxically, Oren, because they're trying to cultivate a donor class that will then support the university with private philanthropy, which you and I are both in favor of. But the problem with taking such a large percentage of legacies is that you're creating a two-tier system. So in part, these universities are educating the children of rich people. And I know that since I came to the United States in 1985, so I moved here for graduate school, the population of the country has increased by about 100 million people. The number of places to study as an undergraduate at the top universities has increased by, I don't know, a couple of hundred at most. Mm-hmm. I mean, so if you have these elite filters, and I also, would want to push back on the idea that you have to go to a certain kind of university in the US to succeed. That's not historically been the case. And I think we should redeploy science funding to make sure it's even less the case going forward. But if people believe there are these elite filters, and if the elite filter doesn't increase, well, the population gets much larger, then you have, exactly today's numbers, which are only a few percentage of people who apply, who are qualified, can get into these top schools. And the people who are legacies are disproportionately favored. And I'm afraid to tell people, may be disappointing or disheartening for some people, but a lot of sports scholarships at some universities do exactly the same thing. They favor people who come from a certain already privileged socioeconomic background. And I think that's unfair. I think these places are limited and scarce, and it should be much more on the basis of true academic merit and potential.
Yeah, you mean the dressage team isn't drawing equitably from across the country?
The dressage team, I haven't checked on that one, but some sailing teams I can think of, some fencing teams perhaps. Lacrosse has also been mentioned. Yes, exactly. There are. If you want to prepare your kids to get into one of those elite schools, I think parents are aware. You start at age, 4 or 5 or 6, and you work on a niche sport that has some advantages in this application process. And from the outsider, you could see, Oren, I think you and I massively agree on this also. That seems unfair because you know what? It is unfair.
Yeah, and so it's interesting. The admissions, there are so many social and cultural debates around various dimensions of admissions, and it has so many downstream effects. To your point, it now affects the way children are raised. It affects we just published a great piece at our magazine Commonplace on the decline of the teenage summer job and the way that, the kinds of formational experiences kids are getting shift now based on what you think a college admissions officer is looking for. I actually think this, though, and you've just connected it also, it connects to this question of sort of geographic dispersion in a sense, that if you did not have things so concentrated in a few of these places, the concern about admissions would be a lot less. If you had more seats that were at what was perceived as excellent institutions, if you risked losing the best students to some other place, if you pursued these approaches, to me, at least, that feels in many ways like a better way to solve the problem than doubling down on how special the Ivy League is and having a bigger cultural fight over who gets that very limited number of seats.
Yeah, look, most of today's big prestigious universities have been around for a while, but they got a big boost in this deployment of science funding during and after World War II. So MIT, my own home for a long time, was the place where the federal government decided to place what was called the RAD Lab. The official name was the Radiation Lab, but it was being used to develop radar. Why was it placed at MIT? Well, the person in charge of the national scientific endeavor under FDR was a chap called Vannevar Bush, who had previously been dean of engineering at MIT. So he decided, with his friends, who were the president of Harvard, the president of Chicago, and a few others, that there should be some of these clusters where you would pull physicists, in particular, from all around the country to work on the war effort. And MIT was chosen by Bush and his friends. Now, was that a fair, open competition or bid? No, of course not. It was a war. But after the war, there was a really important debate, actually, in the run-up to the founding of the National Science Foundation. How widely should the dollars be spread? And people like Bush said, well, look, if you spread it out too widely, you won't get the concentration of merit that we want. And other people like Senator Kilgore from West Virginia said, if you don't spread it out, then you won't get the political support you need, and it won't be fair. And I think, in retrospect, Bush won, but Kilgore was right.
Yeah.
That it became highly concentrated. And also there is agglomeration effects that have been well documented by Enrico Moretti and others, where it is the case, if you put another scientist where there are already more scientists, they will have marginally more impact. But it's also the case, and I've done some work with Enrico, John Gruber and I have, to look at this, that with the exception of a couple of outliers, which mostly means the San Francisco Bay Area, it is also the case if you put scientists in other places, they will be almost as productive as if you put them in those places where they're already more concentrated. And if you build clusters of expertise, for example, in Rochester, just happened to come out at the top of our list when we did our rankings of potential places. People in Rochester were pretty happy with this, I have to say. Fiber optic and photo optics are a big focus there. If you build bigger initiatives around particular technologies where there's a history, there's a talent pool, there's a workforce, you will get a bigger bang for your buck, I would contend. And you'd also have, instead of one or two primary or 5 primary university clusters, you'd have 35. Or why not 50? I mean, almost every state bid for some money to catalyze this initiative under the Chips and Science Act. I don't know if it will continue. But what I like about that, Oren, is what I really like is when I go talk to the states, and John Gruber's had the same experience. When we talk to a governor, unless we look at our notes very carefully in advance, we often forget, are we talking to a Republican or a Democrat? It's the same conversation with the economic development people and so on.
Yeah.
It's the same conversation. They want more good jobs, and they want innovation, and they want the innovation to be commercialized locally, and they want spillover effects, and they don't want the price of housing to go up too much, right? Because you don't want all the value to get trapped in or be captured by the people who own the land.
Yeah.
They want it to be spread through everyone, which is more or less what we did in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We did more of that in that period, I would say, than we've done recently.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the way you were describing sort of the marginal value of agglomeration on the one hand surely exists, but it seems to me very few people consider the marginal value of diffusion. That is, putting that top scientist in Cambridge might make him some percentage points more productive than elsewhere. But what are the things that you get if you put him in St. Louis or Cleveland, or pick your other city that you don't get if he's in Cambridge? What happens if you do start to build up some of these other centers? I had thrown out my sort of preferred provocative idea for kind of framing these kinds of conversations, which was to say, what if we just cap how much federal research funding can go into any given zip code, right? Pick MSA, pick your exact definition, but point being, look, if you guys all want to agglomerate in one place, you can, but you're going to be competing for a fixed set of funds. Whoever wants to go build their center at Case Western, at Washington University, and so forth, there's going to be better opportunity to do it. There are obviously trade-offs there. Would need a little fine tuning around the edges, but how do you evaluate that sort of thing? Does it strike you as in the right direction, as great in spirit, but not how you do it at all? How would you move in this direction?
I like it a lot, Oren. And the reason I like it is I feel it fits with American history. So if you look at how the country industrialized, we did without federal money, by the way. So federal money coming to science is a recent thing, as we already mentioned. So if you look at late 19th century, early 20th century, what actually happened was people had breakthroughs on particular technologies, or they were good at something in a certain place. I happen to know a little bit about northwestern Ohio and what happened in Toledo. And so there was some cheap gas, some glass industry moved there. Then some other people came who were very interested in using glass. Then they became really good at innovations that were glass related. Then they started producing machines that made glass models that they sold to the world. right? So there was this natural agglomeration effect. And if you wanted to be in glass, and I think a lot of the glass relates to the auto industry as well, that was the place to go. So the talent was pulled towards a particular sector. Now, nobody gave Toledo a monopoly on glass. Nobody said other people couldn't do glass. Obviously not. Lots of competition. But the idea that people are pulled towards particular places where it is happening, that's where the action is. That's where you've got to be. I think that's a very natural process. Now, after World War II, much more innovation is coming from science. Much more is coming of science is being driven by federal government money, and therefore much more is politically allocated. Not. I don't mean partisan politically. I mean there's a decision in an agency. Right. We should go with this. And I do think, to be fair to the agencies, a lot of times they're under pressure from Congress to get me that agglomeration effect. I want a bigger bang for my buck. Right? Why are you giving it to this place that has no record or reputation when you could give it to MIT? Right? And I think the answer that you're providing, the answer I'm providing, is, well, if you give enough money for a new initiative to a different place, and you build it, they will come. The scientists will go there because they will move for the labs. Now, it has to be, you have to think about, are we doing a single source supplier? Are we having competition in this? Letting people get monopoly rights over things the government does is never a good idea. But spreading the money around the country, I think is brilliant, Oren. I think it's absolutely needed. And I think a lot of the dissatisfaction we're getting with science, a lot of the view that science is elite, actually comes from the fact that the geography, not for bad reasons, not because it was corrupt or anything, but just because the money followed the money and it followed where the talent already was. That has come to favor just a few places, mostly on the east and west coast. And that's not sustainable politically.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's an analog in the sort of public venture capital space with what's called the SBIR program, where government has required that, look, a lot of the money is going to flow to, places where the big investors are, but some share of small business investment has to be diffused more broadly. And the results of that, I believe, by virtually every measure, have tended to be extraordinary, because there is sort of a counter marginal effect where, probably the guy with the best idea in some place you're not otherwise looking, it probably has a better idea than the guy with the 34th best idea for whatever Uber for this or that they might be pitching. And so I think, there are a lot of ways to structure it where, you can say we're putting aside some pot of money that needs to go out more broadly. An interesting thing about the glass example is it highlights that agglomeration effects probably to a significant extent are technology specific or field specific. That is, there's probably not a lot of value in having all of the top science in these few places, even if you want to have all the top people in one specific area working together. So connecting it back to where we started, what would your reaction be? What do you think reactions in higher education would be if you had the Trump administration, if you had Congress saying, look, it's not that we want to cut the total amount of money we are spending on science, but we do have a lot of these concerns about how things are working, about where the benefits are going. So these schools that are seeing significant cuts, you actually are going to see those cuts, but it's not so that the money disappears going to a tax cut. It's because we're taking that money and funding new labs in other places instead. Putting aside kind of parochial, but we need that money, does that feel like, on balance, at least a tolerable approach, perhaps in fact an improvement on what was happening before?
What I would do, Oren, is give the universities, the existing ones who get a lot of money, the opportunity to relocate some of their activities or to partner with other places, but in a genuine way, not in a way that's some sort of facade, but actually say, look, if you want to keep access to the stream of resources you've been getting from NIH or the federal government, you're going to have to show us that this money is being spent in places that have the following characteristics. One of the characteristics would be they haven't had a lot of money historically. Yeah. And then, I'm back to Hayek here, Oren. I want, as much as possible, decisions to be made by people on the ground who have very decentralized information. And on the point about agglomerations and technologies, I think the key word, the word that people use a lot, but I like this word, is adjacencies. Mm-hmm. Right? So that in Toledo, you start off by making glass, then you're making glass bottles, then you make the machines that make glass bottles, then you're doing other things with glass. A lot of there's glass fiber in spacesuits, which was made in Toledo, for example. So I know this because I've read some history books. I mean, you and I as economists, are not going to be able to figure this stuff out ex ante. So pushing it onto the people on the front lines and saying, look, you get to keep the money, but you've got to find some partners and some places, and you've got to build a lab. Okay, there's a capital expense piece here, right? So that it's not, you can't just shift the money because there's physical facilities. But the point is, develop this in places where you're not already present. Well, why does a university like MIT or any other one you want to name, why does it exist only in one concentrated geographic location? That's some artifact of, I don't know, in this country, the 19th century. If you go back historically to European universities, we like the 14th century. That's why we cluster together. But, we don't say that General Electric should only exist in one town.
Yeah.
I mean, we generally think it's better when large companies exist in multiple places and have multiple talent pools and connect them together. So the university co-location in one place is not necessarily how it needs to be done. In fact, some places, NYU spreads mind, have done pretty well with global campuses, by the way. That's on the education front.
Well,
so
I was about to say, if I were snarkier, I might mention that they seem to have no problem doing this when Abu Dhabi or Dubai is the recipient. Perhaps there are American cities that could work, but I'm not snarky, so I will not bring that up.
Well, no, I don't think it's snarky, Oren, because that's money, right? So how does Abu Dhabi or Dubai or others get them? They put a lot of money, they dangle a lot of money, right? So dangling money is, I think, legitimate and entirely how this is done. And so dangling, I would say dangle money in ways that build science and make it better, and as we've been saying, address the gaps, rather than doing some massive cut and then saying, and by the way, there'll be some new money over here, because I don't know if that's really going to come and how that will happen and so on. So I think there's ways to do this that are not disruptive, but follow the money. Absolutely. These universities they do follow the money. As you know, they are proven to follow the money. And I think doing that with federal research dollars is entirely legitimate.
Fascinating. Well, this has been great. I've gotten to maybe 20% of what I ambitiously hoped we'd get to talk about. Obviously, your other work on institutions and what does and does not lead to prosperity is something very important to us at American Compass, something I'm personally fascinated by. So we may have to do this again at some point, but very grateful for your time, Professor Simon Johnson. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Oren. And anytime, give me a call. Always happy to talk with you and your colleagues. Really a pleasure.
Perfect. Appreciate it.
A pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.
And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass podcast.